All right. Welcome back, everybody, and happy Friday. Welcome to another Future Focused weekly update. For those of my U.S. listeners, hope you had a great 4th of July. For those outside the U.S., I hope you had a great week. I was originally not planning on recording one this week, but then I ended up doing it because the topics were relevant and I had some time. So with that, I want to jump into it. But if you do find value in these, if you think they're helpful, do me a favor, share it with somebody who also might find it valuable, and give the podcast, the YouTube, whatever you listen or watch it on, a rating, review, subscribe, whatever that is. Always helps me and others. So with that, I want to get straight into it. The first one is the case of a rogue AI clone, which may be a little more unique now, but I think it's a risk that I really want to call attention to because I see a rising trend of people exploring the use of AI for this purpose. And there's some real risks. And this article really kind of brought this to attention. So essentially what happened was an influencer, her name is Caryn Marjorie, and advisory before, don't go just look this person up because I don't know anything about what kind of influencer she is or what kind of content you might encounter. So that's my warning on this. I just happened to see the article on it. But essentially, what she did is she's an influencer who made an AI clone of herself. And the purpose she did this for seems harmless enough. She is an influencer, has lots of interaction with people on social media, and it can become very overwhelming and you get lots of messages. And rather than, you can start to build this pressure of you don't want to let people down. You want them to feel like they have a personal connection with you, yet you only have limited capacity. And so AI can seem like a really, really great alternative. You go, hey, I'll train an AI on the way I talk to people, the way I engage, my voice, my tone, some of my content, and then I'll let this AI kind of loose and it can engage with my fans and I don't have to anymore. Depending on who you are, you may have different reactions to that. And that probably doesn't necessarily feel great if you're on the consumer side of it, but you can understand the logic of where somebody goes, yeah, I'll do that and it'll save time and it's adds quality to my audience and helps build my brand. Well, Caryn learned the hard way. What sounds good on the surface often is there's a lot more than meets the eye. And she ultimately put an end to the whole thing because essentially what happened, and this is a risk I've been cautioning about for some time now, is she started seeing the chat logs of how her fans were engaging with her AI chatbot, which they didn't know was an AI chatbot. But essentially, they started having extremely inappropriate conversations with her. And she saw this early on. And what she did was she said, oh, I don't like where this is going. So I'm actually going to do a new generation of it to try and give it more guardrails to make sure it doesn't get quite so romantic. So you can start to see where this is going. So she releases a version of it, starts looking at the chat logs. It's getting pretty nasty. And she goes, I'm going to redo it and create another version of it. And let's just say it didn't help. And as you unpack the interview with her and some of her comments on it, it wasn't necessarily, she was disturbed by the way people were engaging with her chatbot, which again, they thought they were engaging with her. But what she was more disturbed by was how her chatbot was responding back and the kinds of things it was saying and the way it was fueling this and actually encouraging this. And I think this is one of the things that shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody that we have example after example after example of these chatbots give people what they want. And so if what they want is something you wouldn't feel comfortable with, as much as you try and train it out of the AI, you're not going to get it all. And people will find ways to exploit it. And while the article didn't go into great detail, I guarantee if she looks deeper into the chat logs, there may have been times the chatbot tried to push back, maybe especially in the second version where she tried to pull out some of the romanticism that she had, but you can't. And people will keep pushing and they'll try and exploit it. And we've seen this in the past Now, what I don't know is whether her fans or audience knew they were actually interacting with a chatbot or if they actually believed it was her. So, one of the first things, though, that I think as we look at this, it's just worth noting. Her brand, the one thing the article did say, and this is why I gave kind of the warning before you go look her up, was she and her brand was about posting flirty pictures of her and traveling around. Which, if that's the brand you're creating, you have to recognize that you are attracting a kind of audience that is, at least a portion of that audience is going to engage with this kind of flirtatiousness in a way you may not necessarily welcome. And when you relegate that over to AI and you no longer have the authority over what it says, it's going to do that. Now, granted, I think that's a caution to anybody out there to just think twice about, hey, like, what kind of brand am I creating? And is it a brand I'm really comfortable with? Could it go in ways that I didn't really intend? So, not placing judgment on her brand by any means, so much as saying you got to take that into consideration. And I don't want to put the blame on her so much as everybody, as you think about things, think about not just how you would represent or be perceive something, but how might others perceive it and what might that do? So that's just AI thing aside. But then you start to think about the AI point and the fact that you are relegating you. And I think this is one of the things that I've advised companies who are looking to use AI for their HR chatbots to go, you are relegating HR responsibility to AI that you have little to no control over. And you can think you can control it, but you might not be able to. And it's going to go in directions and people are going to push back on it in ways, especially if they know it's AI. If they don't know it's AI, they're still going to. If they know it's AI, they're going to push even harder. So just be thinking about that. So when you're thinking about this on a really personal level of I'm actually relegating me. And just to give an example of this, I had somebody approach me 6-8 months ago or something like that. And they said, you give a lot of advice on different topics related to tech and things like that. And you're a dad and all these other things. Would you be interested in having it? I was basically pitched exactly what Caryn was pitched. And I went, not a chance. I do not want anything representing Christopher Lind that is a AI presence that's designed. It's just, you were opening Pandora's box with this. And Caryn learned the hard way what this is. So one, we need to think about this, yes, organizationally. Anytime we're relegating human responsibility over to AI, we need to remember we do not have as much control over it as we'd like to think. I think the second piece is, this is the kind of stuff that we are going to see more and more of. And while this clearly was a surprise to her, I think she was, again, the part I think that surprised her a lot was the fact that AI went that direction and it continued to basically pour fuel on that. And I think that's a watch out for some of the things where I've called attention to, hey, we need to pull back on some of this training AI for adult purposes because it's going to go way off the rails. Like we may go, no, we're going to draw the line here. And it's just going to push it, as demonstrated by this. She had 2 editions of this. One, she actually tried to strip out all the romanticism from the AI bot, and it still went completely off the rails. So I think that's a caution to how we think about relegating ourselves, especially on a personal level. I mean, it's one thing if I still think you need to be very cautious if you're a company going, yeah, let's do this with customer service, because that still is you. That's your brand that you're entrusting AI with. And do you actually have the trust? But on an individual level, if you're even considering this, I don't know who you are, but if you're even considering this, I will tell you, at least as it stands today, the risks do not justify the rewards. And I get it may come from a good place of wanting people to feel like they can engage with you, but you just got to recognize you only have so much capacity. And there comes a point where you go, AI helping you scale is causing more damage than good. Now, I'll end with the call out to consumers, which, the people who would be on the receiving end of this. This is something that you need to be more and more aware is a reality, because there's not people are not necessarily obligated to tell you that you're interacting with AI. And so you may think you're interacting with a person, having a conversation with a person, and there's really no human on the other end. And with as advanced as these models are getting, you may not be able to detect it. So just going back to some of the things I say all the time, which is be quick to listen, slow to respond, slow to anger, take your time, because you are going to more and more not know who or what you're dealing with when you're interacting with someone. But also with this, gosh, to the people who did, exploit this chatbot and use it for adult purposes it was not intended, please don't do that kind of stuff. And if you are hooked into some of that, get help. It is not doing anything positive for you or the people around you. So all that to say, it was really disappointing, not surprising, in my opinion, not surprising. And I hope that's a warning call to anybody who's considering using AI to replace people holistically. But yeah, just tragic all around. All right. So the next one was this huge study that came out of Harvard Business Review related to meetings and meeting behaviors, meeting patterns, some of the things that we've seen. 450,000 data points or something like that. I mean, it was massive. And I put it in there. I put it in here this week because I read through the article, I read through the study and kind of chuckled at the whole thing because I went, well, I mean, there's some takeaways from this, but is it really all that surprising? And I think this is, again, where we have to be so careful when we read study says or things like this, because it can just be misleading. So all this to say, essentially what the study did was it explored meeting behavior and looked at how meetings have changed since the pandemic. And one of the data points that kind of came up in the beginning was that pre-pandemic, almost 80% of meetings were face-to-face. Now, even this, whenever I see stats, I always want to dig into them because I'm like, is that really true? Because when I hear 80% of meetings were entirely face-to-face, what do you mean entirely? Because when I think back to pre-pandemic with companies I was at, I would say, I mean, that may have been true if literally everybody you worked with was in the same building. But even pre-pandemic, there were remote participants. There were people from other offices or other buildings or clients or customers, think vendors that you were having meetings with. I don't know. And I would challenge the statement that pre-pandemic, 80% of meetings were actually entirely face-to-face. What do you mean entirely? Like there was at least two people in a room amidst other. Anyway, all that to say, we got to be careful when we hear data like this. But what the study found was there was a dramatic shift to virtual meetings, pandemic, people weren't in the office. But what's interesting is despite all the return to office stuff, despite people kind of going back and doing this, meetings have not returned. So even whatever their criteria were, I don't know what the criteria were, but ultimately, people are still attending meetings virtually, even in office settings now. And so meeting behavior has shifted and stayed. It has not gone back completely. Now, this doesn't completely surprise me because I think some of the convenience of meetings, the lack of value that many meetings have, I don't think we should be surprised. And the study didn't necessarily try and draw conclusions on what does this all mean? But I think we need to be really careful about this because I can see companies seeing some of these things and going, well, see, we need to encourage face-to-face meetings to get back to the good old days. And I actually think this is indicative of a bigger problem, which is most meetings are not terribly valuable. And so when the option to do them virtually came up and then they no longer needed to do them virtually, they were like, yeah, but they aren't really adding a whole lot of value. So why would I take the time to get out of my seat, get off my chair, go to a conference room, or go into the office to take meetings? So I think what this is actually highlighting is not necessarily, oh, we need to figure out how to get back to face-to-face meetings. I think it's actually highlighting a bigger problem when it comes to meetings, which is most people don't find meetings to be all that valuable, and certainly not valuable enough to commit their time and energy to going to a face-to-face location. So I think that's one of the things that stood out in this. Now, a couple of the big takeaways they shared from it was, the no participation rates are increasing. Again, to me, this is not necessarily, whoa, this is crazy, something that we need to do something about. Well, no, I do think we need to do something about it, but I think we need to be careful about how we interpret it. Because to me, the no participation rates, they're increasing because we aren't addressing the real problem that most meetings are not all that valuable. And most of the time, people get invited to meetings they have no business being in. And so now they move to virtual. Now people are continuing to check out. It's not surprising that things are declining. So I think we need to be careful how we interpret this, because you could, again, well, people aren't participating. This is where this reverse logic comes in, and it leads to companies making bad decisions. Well, people aren't participating because they're not in person. So if we make them in person, then participation rates will go up. Not necessarily. It may go up or give the artificial impression of going up because now they're locked in a room together and they give the impression of it. But pre-pandemic, I remember people sitting on their laptops or flipping on their phones. You felt good about it because you're like, well, they seem engaged. And when I ask, they look at me and I feel like they're paying attention. But it was a false sense of security. So I think we need to be careful. And I'm not surprised non-participant rates are continuing to increase. Participants are enabling their cameras less often was another stat that came out of this study. This one I have mixed feelings on, in that I do think there's tremendous value in having your camera on in meetings. However, let me just say that I have again seen people take bad direction with this. And what they do is they say, we're going to mandate everybody puts their camera on, without solving the underlying problem of, this is a meeting I have no business being at. I don't know the value of being here, and it's largely a waste of my time. So now this thing is fatiguing, and I'm going to be multitasking the whole time anyway. I don't want my camera on for people to see it. Or one of the things that I've just learned over the years is a lot of times you're invited to meetings with people you may be uncomfortable with. There's not a deep level of trust, things like that. You don't necessarily want them seeing your setup or the fact you are disengaged, or maybe you got to get up for a minute and run to the restroom and you don't want to draw attention to it, type of a thing. I think we just got to be careful of the conclusions we can draw with this. Here's been my observation. I've always been a big on-camera person, even before it was cool in the pandemic. And what I found was, even pre-pandemic, these behaviors existed. And the way I changed the behaviors was, I made meetings valuable. I focused on why we were there. I tried my best to make sure only the people who really should be there and are engaged in the discussion are participating. I model engagement and actually engage with people so that there is value to the camera being on. But I also have clear expectations that, look, if you need to turn it off because something's going on, or you're doing something else, or you need to turn it off and step away from, that's okay. You're not going to get called out or shamed. Or if today's maybe just a day where I just don't feel like being on camera, that's okay too. And you don't need to apologize for that. And what I found is, when I implement those kinds of practices, meetings are value add. People engage in meetings, they participate, and their cameras naturally come on because we engage in relationship building and all of that. But it happens over time. I'll share a quick funny story and then I'll transition. When I joined GE, culture was, don't turn your cameras on. And I hated it because I was running a global team from my home and I liked engaging with people, but I didn't just mandate people turn their cameras on. I asked people why they didn't turn their cameras on and genuinely sought to understand. And some of it came back to, it was not the culture. And a lot of people just at that point were not comfortable with it. It was pre-pandemic. And so people would say, I just don't feel comfortable. I'm maybe not dressed appropriately, or, whatever, not inappropriate, but you know what I mean? I'm not dressed for work or something like that. And so there was a period of time where I intentionally, despite being a senior leader in the organization, dressed down, like way almost comically, to the point where I'd wear a sweaty shirt to a meeting or things like that. And I would openly address the elephant in the room and just say, just so everybody knows, like, you don't need to look a certain way to be on camera. And I want to model that. And I had this scruffy beard and, didn't look the best. And that was on purpose. And it was a way of just kind of helping create this culture where, look, you don't need to show up a certain way to be on camera. And what I actually found is over time, it actually changed not just the culture of meetings I was in. There was kind of this growing reputation of, hey, if you have a meeting with Christopher, you'll probably want to turn your camera on because it's a very comfortable environment to be camera ready. But it actually started to infect the rest of the organization because all of a sudden other people started having the same approach, and then they ran their meetings the same way. So if you get this study and you look at it and you go, well, how do we get people to be more engaged and participate in meetings? I guess my biggest call out to people is, don't do the traditional path of, well, let's just force everybody to turn on their cameras or show up in person. Compliance does not actually get you a better result. So anyway, kind of an interesting study, not all that surprising. The other thing I thought was really interesting was none of the insights or none of the actions actually had anything to do with technology. It all had to do with human behavior and human interaction, which goes back to a lot of the things I say where, if you really want to improve things, focus on the people and the rest will fall into place. All right. So number 3, let's transition to, this was actually kicked off. It's actually been a topic that's been rolling around in my head for a bit, but I've been waiting for kind of the right moment to pull this together. And it actually was inspired by this clip of an Ashton Kutcher interview I saw where he talked about the fact that with the way AI is going, he's confident that at some point there's not even going to be movie production or TV production anymore. We're just going to tell the TV what we want, and it's just going to create whatever that is on the fly. And then we're just going to consume content that way. And I've heard this commentary in a number of different areas where I've heard people say, oh, there was a Pixar style movie clip that AI produced and people were just blown away. And they're like, you just wait. We're just going to do a text prompt and all of a sudden have a Pixar movie that we watch. And I'll be honest, I really don't think that's ever going to happen. It might for some niche cliche groups who just kind of think it's entertaining. There might be a bit of a flash in the pan where something happens, but I really don't think this is going to happen. And it's not just because I don't think the tech is capable. Now, granted, let's address the tech capability out there because there's a bunch of companies like Movie Runner and some of the ones I talked about last week that are getting much more advanced. Sora's capability is incredible. There's a lot more platforms out there that are doing some really impressive stuff around taking prompts and creating video content, cinema quality video content. But what I don't think people often see with that is how much human involvement is involved in that. Even if you look up the Airhead video that was made by Sora, was basically this balloon head person that was going around doing all this stuff. It was actually a pretty artistic, well done thing. But it took some major fire because people said, this was represented as an AI video. But then when you actually scratch beneath the surface, you're like, well, there were actually editors going back and they were making these changes and it didn't quite get this right. And they had to remove all this. And there was a lot of human involvement in that. Now, even if we could get to a point where there wasn't, you can't ignore the human involvement of, well, someone has to create the prompt with the level of detail. And I talked about this last week. Some of these tools, Luma Labs, some of these other ones where you can just say, hey, create this thing. It still doesn't really understand what you want. And you've got to give it a lot of detail. And even with a lot of detail, you'll still be like, well, not quite what I had in mind with this. And so I think even if the tech advances to the point where with a simple text prompt, you could, in theory, create a 30-minute video, I honestly think no matter how advanced the tech gets, it's still not going to be what you wanted. You're still going to go, well, that wasn't quite it. And so now you go from sitting clicking through Netflix or Hulu or Disney, just going, no, not that, not that, not that, not that, to now I have to think up what I want, have it make it, and then go, no, not what I wanted, and then think up more clarifying details or what it actually sounds like a lot more work, to be completely honest. So while Ashton Kutcher had this idea of like, oh, it'll just be great. You just say what you want and then you can watch it. To me, I'm curious what all of you think. To me, that sounds exhausting. And I think this goes back to forget the tech. I think the tech is a long way from even any of this stuff being possible. Could it help assist with some of this stuff? If you've been in the video content space, could it help you create a cutscene or a certain element that you could layer on so that you don't have to make a shoot and do a green screen and do a lot of post-production? Yes, that I think we're already there. I think that'll only expand the ability to do that over longer periods of time versus just a short clip. It will, but it requires a heck of a lot of processing power. So the idea that you could just go to Netflix and go create a cinematic video, 90 minutes, similar to, Minions, but with the flair of the Incredibles, and then poof, it does it. I don't think we realize how much processing power that would take. And so for everybody to have it, I just don't see us even ever getting there, to be quite honest. But then I'm curious what all of you think, because as I even think about that experience, to me, it's fatiguing. A lot of times when I think about entertainment and things that I just want to go consume, I don't want to have to think a lot. That's part of the enjoyment of entertainment, is someone else who is creative, someone else who's put their time, thought, and energy into creating a masterpiece. I don't have to. I'm enjoying their artistic work. And so the thought of going, imagine a world where you have to put all the work into that yourself. That sounds terrible to me, to be completely honest. I do not like the idea or even have any interest of, hey, kids, what do you want to watch tonight? Oh, gosh, now we got to sit and have a brainstorming session and and do all this stuff. Like I said, might there be some novelty for, it's kind of funny. But I just think we grossly undervalue the artistic work that goes into this and how much comes with that. And so could I see it being a super big help to creators and artists who have these ideas and they want to do things and they want to go bigger with it? And so that can be there to bring that to the consumer. Honestly, I think people would go, this is too much work. I don't want to do this. I just want to watch something that somebody else put together. So I just don't see it going there when I think about how human behavior is. And so I'm curious what others think. And if you go, no, that sounds wonderful to me. But to me, I just look at the experience and go, it's rough enough flipping through things and trying something and going, no, I don't really like that. Now I got to go back and try something else versus, oh, it's just, I got to come up with it. But yeah, I think there's just the technical limitations and then just the human behavior barriers that I don't see this going where. I will go on the record saying, Ashton, I think you're wrong. I think you're completely wrong with what the future of entertainment looks like and the role AI will play. I think AI will absolutely play a heavy role in it, but I don't think it's going to be the role that you're framing up or that I've heard others frame up. Okay. Last but not least, I said I only have 4 this week, is if you've been following the industry at all, there's been a ton of layoffs in tech. There's been lots of tech layoffs, big tech companies downsizing their tech talent, especially their tech talent. And that's created all sorts of stuff. It's AI. AI is taking their jobs. And if you listened last week, I talked about some of the real threats AI can bring and how you need to be careful of that. And I'll probably touch on them briefly here. But there was an article in Inc. that talked about this, where one person kind of went off on what the real reasons are, because on the surface, you hear it's AI and AI is taking over the tech jobs. And I actually agree that I think there's some truth in that AI can do coding and that, but it's not just AI robots are now in. And so tech companies are laying them off. Now, I'll share the four things that they outlined as the real reasons. I'll go one by one and go where I think there's some truth to that and where I think there's not. And then ultimately, what does this mean for organizations and then for employees? So the first one he said, no one understands AI, but everyone thinks they do. And what he was really getting at was, as we move into this AI boom, there can be this pressure to just hire all this talent and everybody knows exactly where it's going to go. And so they stand up these organizations, but they don't really know what they're doing. And so it doesn't quite go according to plan. And as a result, they have to wipe people out. And I think there is a lot of truth in that statement. I think there's a lot of truth in that statement that, as an example, I've seen AI companies rise and fall so much in the past, 2 year and a half as people went, oh, this is going to be the big thing. And so they go that route, then it doesn't quite go according to plan. And they either get bought up and everybody gets kind of wiped out because the tech just gets absorbed, or it doesn't go quite as big. And so then people get ripped out. And I think there is some truth to that. So to companies, I would be cautious in how fast and how deep you go into something with the idea that, no, this is going to be the big thing. And the previous point of Ashton Kutcher going, this is where big mainstream media is. Well, if you put together a team that does nothing but how do we create consumer-based prompting for creating text media, I wouldn't necessarily throw all your eggs into that basket, but this goes back to the innovation cycle and how companies should think about innovation. You don't throw your eggs all into one basket. And I think there have been some real mistakes in the tech sphere that could have been mitigated. And I think for companies, they should be mitigated. I think to employees, you need to be careful of this. Like, think through some of the things that you're getting involved with. And if your company wants to throw you onto a project that feels a little like, it looks exciting, but like, is that really viable? Just make sure you've got a backup plan to help prepare yourself or keep your relationships going. So again, I think there's truth to it. This one, I think, may be one of the strongest ones. It talks about investors and boards flew too close to the sun, which is really getting at this. They got too big, too fast. They, really kind of like charged into things, and the economy was uncertain. And so there was a lot of money thrown into it and there was free cash flow, and then things didn't quite land. I think there is, again, truth to that. And I think this one is tied to the first one. There's a lot of hype. There's a lot of stuff. Money was free flowing. The economy didn't quite turn out. People didn't quite know where things went. Some of this is just the nature of doing business. And I think this just goes back to good risk mitigation strategies, both for companies and employees. So again, I think there's some truth to this one. And it's not just as simple as AI got rid of all these people. The one that I thought was interesting, I thought they were interesting. It talked about the fact that tech talent got entitled. And I think there is a lot of truth in this. I don't necessarily point the finger at the tech. I think there's mutual responsibility here. So if you look at what happened with tech talent, and if you've been following workforce trends at all, there's similar things that have happened in others, and I'll connect the dots here. But there has been this just boom around tech, and it was this very niche area that not a lot of people knew about, and you couldn't really explain what these people did, especially to some of your business leaders who were making decisions about it. And so people started going, well, we got to get the best, and we got to do this, and we got to have these people around and all these things. And so people just started requiring ridiculous amounts of money to pay for tech talent. And as a result, you start offering people ridiculous salaries and ridiculous perks and all this stuff. People start to come to expect that. And I do think that the value of tech talent got overinflated. It absolutely did. Is that the company's fault? Is that the tech talent fault? I think there's some mutual responsibility in that. And I think the wisdom in this is you've got to be really careful about this. One, if you're a company, because it's not sustainable. So if you got to look at market trends, and you don't always necessarily even have to look at market trends and go, well, if everybody else is paying their tech talent this, then we have to too. That's what ends up fueling this cycle. But you got to recognize, well, then we might not get the best tech talent, which to me just says this is why you have to have robust development strategies for your talent. So you don't have to go hire the New York Yankees to be your talent. You can go, look, we'll start from the ground and build the talent. And when they get to a point where they need to make more, we'll let them move on, or we'll figure it out at that point. So I think there's some real strategy that companies can take. I think the caution to employees is you got to be really careful, because this isn't just tech talent. I saw this happen at mass when the pandemic hit. And a good example of this was recruiting talent. There was such a shortage of talent. Recruiters became like diamonds to companies. A good recruiter, you didn't even have to be a good recruiter, and you could go command an insane salary for this. And I remember talking to a lot of people I knew who were recruiters when it was the heyday, and it's like, hey, I just got an offer to make $200K to go be a, and frontline recruiter at this company. And I was like, that's not going to be sustainable, and be careful, because you're going to set your lifestyle up, and that's not going to hold, because the skill required, at least for that frontline stuff, it's not a $200,000 a year job. And sure enough, things reset. And I think what can happen is we got to be careful, because things like this, if you're an employee, you really have to be objective about the value you add to a company, and how unique is your talent set, how unique are your skills. And if a basic job suddenly, because of a certain thing in the economy or where the world is, blows up, hey, if you can ride the wave, good for you. But just know at some point that wave's going to crest. And when it does, it's going to come crashing down. And so just make sure you've built your life around the floor, not the ceiling. And I think that's one of the things. But I think there's truth to this. I think there is truth to this, that the tech companies went, whoa, we went way all in on this tech. We got carried away with what we were paying. And now AI has the wave crested, and we're back to where it probably should have been in the first place. And that's a risk that everybody faces. The other thing it talked about was the wrong people are in charge. And I think there's some truth to that. I think some of the way that the tech trajectory was positioned, and the stories that were being told, and kind of the egos that got inflated, and then it was like, oh no, what do we do? And we're not going to take responsibility for this, so let's just wipe out the people. And that's the part that really bothers me, is when this kind of stuff happens, usually it's the vulnerable. And I don't mean vulnerable like, oh, these poor tech talent, they couldn't have done anything. No, but like, when it comes to the totem pole, they were the easiest people to just boom, sideswipe. And instead of holding the people accountable, going, wait, who is the one who made the decision to build these teams? Who's the one who decided to set salaries at this rate? Who's the one who decided to grow this team that ultimately added no value because it was chasing something that there was no business case even put out? That is unfortunate, because oftentimes where it'll get thumped is the people who were just doing their job, showing up, trying to just do what they were told, and then it all falls apart, and they're the ones who take the heat. And the one person either goes and starts with another company, or they just get their job position moved. So I think there's some truth in all of these. And I think this is also why, as employees, you got to be really careful, because some of this stuff can happen. It can happen to anybody. It happened to tech talent now. It can happen to anybody. And with the advance of AI, it's a real risk. If you listen to last week's, the whole 60-team writer team that got wiped out by AI. So everybody is vulnerable to this. There's one thing, though, that I think was completely left out of this article, which is AI is extremely, extremely expensive. And there's this perception that AI is cheap and free, and, hey, you can use GPT-4o for free. And even if you need the paid, it's only $20 a month. It's not all that expensive. But what a lot of us aren't seeing is how much money these tech companies are pouring into building this. It's extremely expensive to build. It is extremely expensive to build. And so they're pouring tons and tons, trillions of dollars, thousands of employees into building this. And then it gets to a point where it's like, okay, we're there and we've spent all this money. And now what do? We got to balance the scales. And I think we're seeing some of the right sizing happening in the tech industry right now. And I just don't know that it's avoidable, but it is interesting to watch this use case and say, hey, to anybody out there, regardless of what field or industry you're in, these are the kinds of things you need to be watching for and paying attention to, because if you don't, you are going to get blindsided and this will sneak up on you and you'll think, no, I couldn't possibly be touched. I'm, impenetrable and what I do is so important and all the best decisions were made and this organization is, sound. And then out of left field, things can change on a dime. So I think that's really a lot of what we're seeing. And I think there's a lot of wisdom that we can take from this and apply to really anybody. But those were the big four that I had this week. I hope you found this helpful. I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful weekend. And like I said, if you had a holiday weekend, I hope you're enjoying it. And we will see you on the other side.